Gosh, that's embarrassing. Madam Chair, thank you. Thank you very much. National Chief, regional chiefs, including Bobby Cameron from Saskatchewan, chiefs and vice chiefs, elders and veterans, distinguished guests, participants all in the 38th Annual General Assembly of the Assembly of First Nations. Je vous remercie.
I thank you for you to have invited me to our 38th Annual General Assembly. It's an honor for me to be with you today, and I'm happy to welcome you in our beautiful city of Regina.
To be able to welcome all of you to my hometown of Regina, located on Treaty 4 territory and in the homeland of the Métis, and my deep gratitude to the First Nations and Métis people for welcoming newcomers to this land for generations. And what you asked in return was and is peace and honor and respect. And all of that is long overdue. As you know, our government has been working very hard to create a renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. The Prime Minister has repeated over and over again, including in mandate letters to every single minister in his government, the unique importance of this relationship in every possible way. We have been devoting unprecedented resources, including financial resources, but also others, as we work to rectify disparities and injustices and to fix systemic problems which have built up over more than 150 years, but which must be resolved in a much shorter span of time. I'm going to focus my remarks today on what we're doing specifically to this end within my own portfolio of public safety and emergency preparedness, all consistent with the calls of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But I would like to mention two things particularly at the outset. First, I know everyone impacted by the wildfires in British Columbia are very much in our thoughts and prayers, including the residents of Ashcroft and Anaheim and some 20 other First Nations communities. And I've had the opportunity through this day to talk about those concerns with a number of you. And I am deeply concerned by a number of the stories that I have heard about confusion and turmoil and gaps in the responses and in the communications among different orders of government and First Nations people. Such a state of affairs is simply unacceptable. We need to have protocols discussed and in place well in advance so that when disasters of this kind happen, there is an absolutely seamless and totally effective response capacity. And I am dedicated to working with you and with all other governmental partners everywhere to achieve that capacity. I'm sure that you'll all join me in offering our sincere gratitude to the firefighters and the other first responders, including members of First Nations emergency services, for their brave, tireless, and selfless efforts, as we have witnessed in the news over the last 2 weeks. We thank them, and we pray that they stay safe. And let me also say a very special thank you to the people of Tk'emlúps First Nation and others who have provided outstanding relief and haven, support and comfort to hundreds of evacuees, both First Nations and non-First Nations alike. Your efforts Your efforts have been impressive, and the whole country is enormously proud of the way you have responded. The other thing I want to mention is that while I'll be doing some talking over the next few minutes, a big part of renewing the Government of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples is, and it must be, listening and hearing. Meaningful progress requires open and frank exchanges, the willingness to have difficult conversations, and the acceptance of everyone's right to be heard respectfully. And that's why, for example, and here I'm going to segue into some of my portfolio responsibilities, that's why a key part of the national security legislation, which I introduced in the House of Commons in June, provides protecting the civil rights to advocate and protest. Legislation that we have put before Parliament has two simultaneous goals: to ensure that Canadians are safe and to safeguard their rights and freedoms in the process. In 2015, the AFN's submission to Parliament about the former government's Bill C-51 said, and I quote, "Indigenous peoples' laws and legal traditions embrace a balanced view of security, development, environmental protection, and fundamental rights. We have deep and strongly held traditions that respect individual autonomy, freedom of speech, and how to balance these for the collective good. Canada can learn from this." End of quote. And indeed we can. Peaceful dissent is not a threat. It is the hallmark of a free and democratic society. The new national security legislation that our government has proposed to correct the errors in C-51 will revamp Canada's national security framework to ensure that it functions effectively to keep us all safe, while at the same time preserving and upholding our rights and freedoms, including freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. The bill will be debated when the House of Commons resumes sitting this fall. To date, it has received pretty favorable responses, but I look forward to further contributions from the AFN on this critically important subject during the parliamentary committee hearings that will happen through this fall. I also look forward to continued engagement with all of you on the subject of policing and community safety. And we've done some of that today, and we've done it from time to time over the last several months. Last month, when the Prime Minister and National Chief Bellegarde signed a memorandum of understanding outlining shared priorities, this, policing and community safety, was listed as priority number 1. And I agree. It's not number 3 or number 6 or number 8 or 9. Community safety needs to be number 1 in order for people to truly benefit from all of the other things that are on the agenda, from all of the other priorities. It is important that community safety be achieved as a precondition. And I hope that all of you will work very closely with me to make sure that we keep that attention focused in that way. From a federal perspective, a big part of this activity involves strengthening relationships between the RCMP and Indigenous communities. I am delighted to see that groups of Indigenous young people from every corner of Canada are on a regular, periodic basis now visiting the Depot Training Academy here in Regina every year to share their hopes and their fears about their home communities and what they want to see done to make those communities healthy and strong. The contributions from young people in collaboration and consultation with the RCMP is a very constructive thing. I'm encouraged that the RCMP has committed itself to full cooperation and participation in the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Indeed, the force has an important role to play to make sure that that process is successful and complete. And as we seek a new RCMP commissioner, we are very aware of the need to find someone to take on that job. I think in many ways it is the toughest job in the public service of Canada. We need someone to take on that role who can, by their behavior and conduct, earn the trust and the confidence of Indigenous communities. We also need to recruit a much larger number of Indigenous RCMP officers to serve in the nation's police force. We also need to be listening and to consult Indigenous leadership, as we have done, including at regional engagement sessions across the country last year, as we work to develop a renewed approach to Indigenous policing through the First Nations policing program, the FNPP. Many of you have raised that with me today. This past spring, our federal budget provided just over $100 million more over 5 years to address some of the most immediate needs of Indigenous police services. But that can only be a start. And I'm continuing to press for many ways to renew and strengthen Indigenous policing, including financial sustainability for those police services, and updated First Nations policing policy, which currently dates way back to 1991. Building on the evidence about what works to respond effectively and appropriately to police and public safety challenges in Indigenous communities, and considering seriously alternative and innovative approaches to service delivery, always in partnership with the communities themselves. Police governance is another issue that we need to tackle in a new FNPP. How can we best ensure solid professionalism, transparency, and accountability? And while it is not under the umbrella of the FNPP, and not even within federal jurisdiction, let me pause for just a moment to pay tribute to Senator Murray Sinclair for his willingness to assist in examining some painful circumstances that have been broadly reported in Thunder Bay. The brilliance that he showed in the TRC process will prove helpful, indeed invaluable, in response to the request that has been made of him by the Ontario Civilian Police Commission. We wish Senator Sinclair very well. And at the same time, as we work to improve police services, my department is collaborating with Indigenous communities to develop and implement community safety programs to help prevent violence and victimization. Public Safety Canada has engaged with over 100 Indigenous communities as part of its community safety planning process, and we are currently funding dozens of crime prevention programs in Indigenous communities across Canada. I congratulate those communities on their leadership. And for example, since we're here in Saskatchewan, the community around La Loche had a very successful experience from 2010 to 2015 with Project Venture, an outdoor experiential youth development program. Participants reported a reduced likelihood of substance abuse, stronger academic performance, improved communications with parents, and greater interest in community involvement. I know First Nations and Métis people were disappointed when the funding for that program ended in 2015. I am therefore very pleased to announce and to confirm that $2.2 million has been allocated through to 2021 for a new project venture involving students at both the La Loche Community School and the nearby Clearwater River First Nations School. Up to 450 Indigenous youth and their families will benefit from this initiative. This kind of activity helps to achieve our shared objective of preventing violence and victimization, rather than only dealing with it after the fact. And it reduces the need for the involvement of the criminal justice system. It's also an approach to community safety that will help address, and we heard some of this before in some of the remarks earlier this afternoon, help to address the unacceptable overrepresentation of Indigenous people in correctional institutions. Indigenous people make up 4% of the population of Canada, but over a quarter of Canada's federal prison population, and over a third of federally incarcerated women in Canada are Indigenous. Some of the numbers at the provincial and territorial level are even starker. This is an intolerable situation, and changing it is an overarching priority for me. In addition to targeted community safety programs, we know that a big part of addressing this problem involves systemic issues facing Indigenous communities and closing the gaps that Chief Bellegarde has talked about so many times, closing the gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in areas like education and economic opportunity. And so, as National Chief Bellegarde said this morning, in our last two federal budgets, we have committed over $11 billion over 5 years for Indigenous education and training and social infrastructure like housing, healthcare, and cultural activities, and help for thousands of Indigenous students to get post-secondary education, to strengthen adult education in the North, improved health and mental health outcomes, and to support on-reserve youth looking for jobs. All of it will help create more virtuous cycles of education, employment, optimism, and opportunity, and result, in the long term, in fewer Indigenous people involved with the criminal justice system. We've also increased funding for the Indigenous Justice Program, which promotes restorative justice as an effective alternative to the mainstream criminal justice system. And we've put some significant new money into the Indigenous Court Workers Program, which helps ensure that Indigenous people interacting with the justice system understand and can exercise their rights, and that officials in the system are aware and responsive to their particular Indigenous needs and realities. And for Indigenous people in federal correction institutions, we're working to enhance the capacity of the Correctional Service of Canada to provide effective, culturally appropriate interventions in collaboration with criminal justice partners and community stakeholders to support the rehabilitation and the safe integration of offenders back into their communities. To this end, Budget 2017 included $65 million over 5 years to help previously incarcerated Indigenous people heal and rehabilitate and find good jobs. The budget also included nearly $58 million over 5 years to improve appropriate mental health care for inmates in federal institutions. And in June, I was pleased to introduce legislation recently that will build on that investment and strengthen Canada's federal correctional system by restricting by law, for the first time ever, the use of administrative segregation in Canada. When that new law is enacted and implemented, Canada will be among the very best in the world for how we address this issue. It's commonly known as solitary confinement, and we are changing that paradigm in Canada. The bottom line is that there need to be fewer Indigenous people in the correctional system, and those who are there must receive effective, culturally appropriate programming and treatment focused on rehabilitation and safe, effective reintegration. We've made some progress, but there is much more work to be done, and I look forward to doing that work in collaboration with you. Finally, let me touch on one other part of my portfolio, and that is emergency management. In May, we had a very productive meeting in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador with Indigenous leaders and representatives of provincial, territorial, and the federal government about how to work together to strengthen emergency preparedness in Indigenous and northern communities. At that meeting, we recognized the need to close the gap between emergency management in Canada overall and emergency management in Indigenous communities, as well as the importance of engaging communities early, before the fact, on the development of policies and program. Critically, we committed to work collaboratively with Indigenous organizations and communities, and I've mentioned this to several of you today, to compile a complete national inventory of emergency management capabilities. The goal is to better understand the nature and the magnitude of all the risks that face each community. Are they acute or are they chronic? What Indigenous resources exist to deal with those risks? Are appropriate emergency response plans in place or not? And where there are gaps, we need to identify those gaps so that they can be filled and dealt with before a disaster strikes. And we can be ready to make use of all existing resources on a moment's notice with clearly specified protocols for how we work seamlessly together. One example we discussed in St. John's was the possibility of developing evacuation plans that would allow Indigenous people who have to leave their homes because of flooding or wildfires to be hosted by other Indigenous communities, rather than having elders moved to distant and unfamiliar locales. That kind of planning has to be done in advance based on a full understanding of what facilities and resources are truly available. When it comes to this issue, as well as many others, and those that I haven't had time to touch on today, I look forward to continued work cooperatively and productively with the Assembly of First Nations, with Indigenous leaders, and members of Indigenous communities across Canada. We all know that in these and other areas, the progress that we have made so far is dwarfed by all that remains yet to be done. Getting it done requires even more good faith engagement, partnerships forged through respect and recognition of a true nation-to-nation relationship, and a whole lot more hard work. I remember the story of Nelson Mandela, who was asked about his long walk to freedom. And he said, you climb those mountains, you climb them slowly and painfully with great effort, and you get to the top of the mountain and you look over, and what do you see? Another mountain. We have to keep climbing the mountains together, and to do so with a good heart and goodwill and absolute determination that we will walk this walk successfully together. Thank you for listening. Miigwech Tensi, hi hi.